So feel free to enjoy the refreshments during the breaks as we transition. The HEA is one of the topics that I really wanted to talk about because it's really important. And actually, we had a hard time finding anybody to touch it right now because it's such an interesting bundle of problems. And so that's why I'm here today. I can tell you that, so there's a primer that was written by the Congressional Research Service last year. Alexandra HEA drafted it. She's one of their social policy individuals who specializes in post-secondary education. We had a meeting with her yesterday afternoon, in fact. And so I used her primer and then we got to talk to her. So I got some good input on it. In addition to meeting with her and her primer, I also went through not all of Prosper, but literally all 811 pages of the Aim Higher Act. So that's all directly referenced in here, as well as a few other things. So if you catch any mistakes, please let me know. I'm not perfect, but I really tried. So in case you don't know, the HEA, or the Higher Education Act, is referred to as the single most important legislation when it comes to education and the government. It oversees everything. This covers student aid, regulations for accreditability, any sort of responsibilities that they have. So we're going to talk about the basics of HEA and the structure of it, talk about the recent attempts to reauthorize it, the rulemaking process, which is not technically part of HEA, but is how HEA is implemented, the major hurdles that we have moving forward, and specifically how we're going to move forward, the kind of messages and the paths we're going to take. So reauthorizations are supposed to take place every 5 years. That's when it was written, drafted in 1965, that was the condition. And it's done to meet new needs, public demands, policy objectives. So for example, student loan debt is a huge issue, and so a lot of the HEA reauthorization attempts are trying to address it. It also has to do with reordering the budget. Of course, that's a major component. We've talked about this. And so HEA has to address those as well. There are two general methods for reauthorizing. The first are official HEA reauthorizations. Some of these are comprehensive and cover every aspect. Others are smaller components that tend to address all of Title IV or Titles 1 through 4 or some aspect of it. And then there's off-cycle legislation. These are one-off pieces that modify the HEA. Cleary Act of 1990 is one of them. So in case you didn't know the story behind it, Jean Cleary was a freshman who was raped and murdered in her dorm room in 1986. Once her parents found out soon thereafter that there had been 38 violent acts on campus in the last 3 years, none of which had been reported. So they pushed for this legislation to ensure that crime statistics on campus are made available to the students on campus as well as to prospective students. This is important because Cleary is going to come up in our discussions about HEA and several other things. So to get by in between reauthorizations and when new administration comes through, we have these negotiated rulemaking periods that the Department of Education goes through. That's one of the things that we're going to talk a lot about, specifically later on, and that's particularly relevant in between these reauthorizations. So in terms of history, okay, so it was created in 1965. By 1972, we had Title IX and Pell Grants. I found out yesterday from ACE that Title IX edits have not been made since its implementation. It's only been rulemaking. There have been no actual changes to Title IX since then. Did you know that? I didn't know that. In the 80s, they implemented the federal needs analysis in terms of who gets needs. Things started getting more complicated in the 90s. They actually started cracking down a little bit on for-profit institutions. By 2008, which was its last reauthorization, they implemented a lot of different things. I don't know how you can see that. Flexibility for differently able students, public service loan forgiveness program that we've talked a lot about was implemented there, addressing predatory lending. But that expired in 2013. So a lot of those elements have been extended until certain periods. Some of those extensions have expired. So right now we are under extension. A great need for the complete reauthorization of HEA is a major issue. Okay, and that's one reason why we talk about it a lot. It's one reason why Congress talks a lot about. It's 10 years out of date at this point, and it's supposed to be reauthorized every 5 years. And we've got a ton of problems that have to be addressed. So there are 8 titles in HEA. We are not going to talk about all of them. There are 3 that have to do with graduate and professional students for the most part. The first are the general provisions that institutions must meet to receive any sort of federal aid. So Clery Act, for example, is one of them. There's also borrower defense, that so it allows institutions or allows students whose institutions may have lied to them to receive any sort of compensation. They can have their loans forgiven if they lied or if these loan organizations lied. Gainful employment, institutions have to prove that the students who have graduated are gainfully employed. There's anti-discrimination, also known as Title IX. There's also protection of student speech and making informed decisions about colleges, so it's a sort of transparency, as well as the National Advisory Committee on Institutional Quality and Integrity. We're primarily going to talk about the first 2. When it comes to Title IV, so these are all the different elements to federal aid. There's one in the middle that you can't really see too well because it was terminated some time ago and hasn't been replaced. These 3 are the only real 3 that apply to graduate and professional students. So these are the 3 that we're going to focus on. The last is Title VII. These are graduate and post-secondary improvement programs. The last 3 of these are all related to the institutions to create programs designed to meet certain needs. This here is actual the creation of specific programs toward graduate students. So in our conversation with Stephanie this morning, she mentioned JAVITS. This is that program. It's designed to provide fellowships for non-STEM PhD students. There's also GAN that she mentioned, Graduate Assistance in Areas of National Need. That's another program that are saved, right, but not funded in the case of JAVITS. There's the Thurgood Marshall Legal Education Opportunity Program for disadvantaged students, and then there's the creation of master's degree programs at historically Black colleges and universities. Note that 2 of these have not been funded since 2011. So this is what she was referring to, and them being alive. We're just grateful they're alive, though they have no funding. So they're on life support, basically. So there have been 2 attempts in the last year or so to reauthorize HEA. The first is PROSPER. It came through the House Committee on the Education and Workforce. And it was approved in the committee back last December. But there was not a lot of support in the House when they would attempt to do whip counts to see if they could push it through. They gave it to the Senate. They haven't moved much on it, but they are working on their own to sort of look at HEA. Senator Alexander, we talked about this morning, his focus has been prioritizing bipartisanship. He's come out several times and saying, I'm not moving on anything that we can't move on together. They did release a white paper on institutional accountability, took in some comments from the public. And then they also started working with the Senate Republicans and Democrats, actually both